The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As many of you know, I've long been studying the life and career of our 9th U.S. President, William Henry Harrison. While we haven't reached his presidency yet on this podcast, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to interview an author and historian who just wrote a new book on Harrison and his complicated antagonistic relationship with Shawnee Chief Tecumseh. The book is Gallop Toward the Sun, Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation, and it is described as, quote, a vivid account of the rivalry with its high-stakes diplomacy and bloody battles between future President William Henry Harrison and the Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, and of the Native American alliance that fought against westward expansion. The author, Peter Stark, is an adventure and exploration writer and historian. Born in Wisconsin, he studied English and anthropology at Dartmouth College and took a master's in journalism from the University of Wisconsin. A longtime correspondent for Outside Magazine, Stark has also been published in Smithsonian, The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and Men's Journal. His book Astoria was a New York Times bestseller, received a PEN USA Literary Award nomination, and was adapted into an epic 2-part play. Peter and I had a wonderful conversation about his work, the fascinating historical figures he covered in his book, geopolitics in the early 19th century, and much more. Thus, after these brief messages, we'll transition into our conversation.
Mad Magazine.
Advertising mascots.
B-movie posters.
And cartoons.
Oh yeah, can't forget cartoons.
If you get the funky connection that ties these pop culture gems together, you'll dig Two Designers Walk Into a Bar.
See, we're a couple of creatively curious pals living between the bookends of grand museums and dive bars.
Hey, you know the place, the sweet spot where highbrow and lowbrow become drinking buddies.
So join our barroom chats as we talk influential work and uncover stories of how the familiar became iconic. Think behind the music for the stuff we love.
Check out our website at twodesignerswalkintoabar.com.
And listen wherever you get your podcasts or visit evergreenpodcasts.com.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us today on Presidency. So glad to have you here.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, and it's interesting when the conversation started about having you on Presidencies, I was actually at that point working on a script for the narrative series, which discussed Astoria. And so naturally, your book on Astoria was one of the sources that I used for it. And I was like, well, this is a coincidence.
That is a coincidence. And one of the really weird things about this is that Astoria, that the heart of that story occurs at the same moment that the heart of this Tecumseh-Harrison story is occurring. August 1810 was when the Astorians launched from New York to get to the West Coast, and August 1810 was when Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison faced each other on the front lawn of Grouseland, the governor's mansion out in the wilderness of Indiana Territory.
And that's always been a fascinating moment for me. And I shared a little bit of this before we started recording. William Henry Harrison has been one of those figures in presidential history that's fascinated me. And so naturally, I've read quite a few biographies of him. And that moment, that standoff has always been one that I've gravitated towards to learn more about, and was able to cover that in the narrative series. So it's a powerful moment. It's a powerful time, this lead up to the War of 1812, and these cultures, all of these cultures coming together on what Americans saw as the Western frontier. And so, for our listeners, just to remind you, this is Peter's latest book is Gallop Toward the Sun, Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation. And it is a fascinating read, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to talk with Peter more about this book. And especially, I've got to start with a Harrison question. Just have to. Because Harrison, and as we were discussing before we got started, Harrison is one of those presidents that folks don't know as much about. He is, as you said, a trivia question, but he played such a role in this time in the history of North America and what became U.S. history. And so I want to start, though it's not listed often as one of the big achievements of Harrison's career, would you mind taking a moment to talk about what was dubbed the Harrison Land Act of 1800 and its importance, not just as part of Harrison's legacy, but in the westward expansion movement of the United States?
Yeah, and that's first I have to let listeners know that Jerry and I were talking ahead of time, and when he said that he's been following William Henry Harrison for quite some time, I was just blown away, because this is a very rare body of knowledge that someone who knows about William Henry Harrison. And, as we were just saying, he's kind of known as a trivia question. And as having the shortest lived presidency, 1 month in office before he died. And that was much later in his life. And as a young man, he was extremely consequential in the westward movement. And in some way, I say that he was the one who really perfected the mechanism to launch the westward movement with the energy that it accumulated. And much of that came from the Harrison Land Act of 1800. So you have to think that Harrison, at this point, I think he was 27 years old. I think it was maybe 26 and turning 27. And here's this Virginia plantation era, goes over the mountains, becomes an Indian fighter. Then he starts going to politics, realizing he doesn't have much of a future otherwise. And he becomes elected chosen really, the Northwest Territories delegate to Congress in Philadelphia. And which means he doesn't have an actual vote, but he can talk. And he's a good talker. William Henry Harrison has been his whole life, will continue to be. And when he gets to Congress in the fall of 1799, this is how early it is. George Washington has just died. They're making funeral arrangements for George Washington. And Harrison, like literally and figuratively, stands up in Congress and says, I've come from the Western frontier, and you in Congress really need to do something about making lands available for the little guy, not the big guy, because what Congress had been doing, and the whole kind of federal apparatus such as it existed, was when land was acquired, whether you want to say taken, stolen, cheated, bought from the Indians, the tribes, the Congress was offering it to essentially wealthy investors, land investors, speculators. I mean, kind of like venture capitalists, and mostly on the East Coast, whether it only wasn't East Coast in terms of venture capitalists at that point. And so the Western lands, these Indian lands, these former tribal lands, were being made available only to a certain kind of financial elite. And it took a lot of financial engineering to buy these big chunks of land. So Harrison said, wait, let's do it a different way. Let's make this land, these lands acquired from the tribes, available to the little, poor white settler who wants to move beyond the mountains and start a new life. And so he proposed to Congress. This went through a committee. He was named the head of a committee, even though he had no vote technically. That instead of, let's see if I can remember the figures right, but I think the minimum lot size, I believe, memory serves from my research here, and in the book, that the minimum lot size that the federal government sold of lands acquired from the Indians in the Northwest Territory, which is essentially most of the Midwest and Upper Midwest, the minimum lot size was 640 acres, which is a square mile, which is an enormous chunk of land. And Harrison wanted to say, no, what little guy can afford? Nobody can afford that. Who's like a hands-on, dirt farmer. We got to make it much smaller. and make it affordable for the little guy. And so he proposed, again, I think I've got this right. He proposed knocking it down to 180 acres rather than 640. And he proposed like giving these incredibly easy credit terms. I call it like it's one of today's, bargain basement appliance warehouse sales where there's, no money down, no interest, and 4 years to pay. It was almost those terms. It was a little money down. I don't think there was interest, and you had 4 years to pay. So you could essentially buy a small piece of land on credit for it was the center of the Harrison Land Act of 1800. And that just suddenly there are all these people who could afford land who hadn't been able to. And of course, Harrison also proposes, well, we need to open up convenient branch banks or branch offices, land offices, where these guys can go buy their land out on the frontier. So they open like 4 or 5 land offices out in the Northwest Territories. And suddenly, the flood really starts at that point of settlers coming west. And so it was a crucial moment, 1799, 1800, a crucial moment in a way, the infancy of the United States and what this nation would become, how far west it would go and what it would embrace and what values it would embrace too. So it was really important at the moment.
Yeah. And, in Harrison's career, that is one of the main focus areas of his career is this idea of westward expansion, of being able to have settlers come and settle these Western lands. But in order to do that, as you mentioned, Peter, this involved land treaties with the native peoples who were already on these lands. And, Harrison would become extremely involved in those when he became the governor of the Indiana Territory. He would be responsible for being one of these agents to negotiate with native peoples to be able to make these land treaties. And you wrote in your book that, quote, Harrison had shown some empathy for a brief moment as he witnessed the advance of frontier civilization corroding traditional native culture. This, however, would not last. So I was wondering if you would mind speaking to Harrison's views on native peoples and the impact that this had on his work in negotiating these land treaties.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and complex question. And it's also one, it's somewhat difficult to answer, just yes or no, because Harrison had a kind of a chameleon-like ability to go with the moment and work the moment and work his political superiors, to his best advantage. So that and his attitude towards Native Americans and towards the tribes as a whole, or the individual tribes, evolved in a sense, and in a sense, it never really went anywhere. So we were just talking about how in 1799, 1800, he was a non-voting delegate to Congress and proposes Harrison Land Law. Well, that same year, later that year, he was appointed. At this point, Ohio split off to become the first state out of the whole chunk of the Northwest Territory, and so that left this whole other huge chunk, now called the Indiana Territory. And Harrison was appointed governor of the Indiana Territory, and he moved first on his own and then brought his family to this far outpost of Vincennes, way, way out on the frontier, kind of an island federal land, way out on the frontier, mostly occupied by Indian tribes, and a few white settlers were coming nearby. And Harrison, when he got there, seemed very empathetic towards what was going on with the tribes. And he wrote this letter to the Secretary of War under Jefferson, essentially to Thomas Jefferson himself. He wrote a letter saying, these people are in deep trouble. Their cultures are dying. They're dying. But that as soon as whites come close, they bring these sort of terrible afflictions. You'd start with the familiar ones. I mean, disease, whiskey, and then this sort of sense of violence that comes with it. And the whites were essentially stealing game, poaching game, killing game, just kind of wantonly, and they were settling on lands that they weren't allowed to settle on. They were squatting on lands, and that Harrison could see in the streets of this little teeny town, Vincennes, way out on the frontier, that the Indian cultures were just dying whenever they were exposed closely to the white settlers. And so he wrote to Jefferson and Secretary of War Dearborn that we should really think about, do we want to do something to take care of these people and save these people? And it seemed very empathetic in this letter. And and before that, he'd been an Indian fighter. So I think he had this sort of objectified view of Indians as warriors, enemy warriors, was very deeply embedded in his mind. But then he saw, okay, here are these people in this town, and their society is crumbling. And the sense of empathy arose in him, and he expressed it. I think part of that sense of empathy came from his wife and his mother-in-law, who also showed up in this tiny town. And it was just when they showed up that he actually wrote this letter expressing empathy about what was happening to the tribe. So it was like he had this sort of revelation in that moment, but it didn't last. It was kind of a brief flicker, and then it just seemed to kind of disappear under his quest to gain more lands under the direction of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's interesting. So you mentioned his wife. Before we go back a little and dive a little further into what was going on with the land treaties, I just wanted to take a moment to see if you would mind speaking about what we know about Anna, or as she was known, Nancy Sims Harrison, his wife, what her relationship with Harrison was like and what her role was in establishing their home in Vincennes.
Yeah, I think that Anna Nancy Harrison, is really one of the most fascinating characters I've run across in American history, and hardly gets a mention, even less so than her sort of trivia question husband, 1 month president. And that she was so unusual for her time in that she was one of the most highly educated women of her time. And yet she ended up on the really far out on the frontier. And she brought an Eastern sensibility, but somehow managed to live out on the frontier with us coming from a very different background. She'd been educated at the finest Eastern schools for girls, and the equivalent of private academies. It was called the Clinton Academy on Long Island was where she started her education, and then in a school for girls in Manhattan. And so she was highly educated, yet she ended up connecting with William Henry Harrison, who had gone over the mountains, and he'd become the Indian fighter. And it was at that time that Nancy Harrison moved west also, because her father, Judge John Sims Harrison, or Symes, was one of these big Western land investors. So he had moved west, and with him eventually came his daughter Nancy, and Nancy ended up meeting William Henry Harrison through a fellow Virginia plantation connection, another plantation family who had moved to Kentucky, and that's how they met. And so now here's this young woman who's highly educated, and she becomes engaged and then marries, elopes actually, with this Indian fighter, young military officer, William Henry Harrison. And I think that she's the one who really brings this, what I feel is a much more enlightened sensibility or empathetic sensibility out to the frontier and out to William Henry Harrison, who has this kind of moment of sympathy, moment of empathy with the tribes as he's watching them deteriorate around Vincennes, as the white settlers arrive. And I really do think it's his wife, his wife of now 2 or 3 years, when she moves out and with his mother-in-law, and the women look around and they see, oh my God, what is going on here? I think that's what really opens William Henry's eyes to what's going on with the tribes and the hardships and deterioration they're facing.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, I think that folks have this conception of the frontier and, it's just wilderness and folks are out there by themselves, but there are families there, and those families have impacts on the individuals who are in these offices, who are involved in these events. And so I think it's important to kind of have that context as well, to know that, Nancy was there, her mother was there, they ended up having kids, and just understanding that household context at the same time as William Henry Harrison was engaged in his political career and negotiating with Native peoples.
And I think that's a really good point. And I think that's something that's lost a lot in when we're writing or reading early American history or any kind of history, is that sort of on the ground reality that gets lost in the telling of the big events. And it's something I've tried to be really mindful of when I'm researching and writing. And I've researched and written a lot about exploration history and frontier history, and in part I have an adventuring background myself, doing kind of pretty out there travels, and actually in some cases you could call it exploration in edgy situations. And so I feel that's kind of the original research I bring to much of these stories, and that a lot of that really looking at what's going on the ground and having some familiarity with some of these situations myself, not as extreme as this particular one, but that you realize it all happens within a human context. And so the fact that William Henry's wife now shows up on the frontier in this really gritty, violent, depressing environment, and is I see it would be his stepmother-in-law. I guess it was Nancy's stepmother, and that obviously has a huge impact on how he looks at the world. And plus his small children are arriving at the same time, and she's bringing some with them, and then they have more. So I think it's a really important thing to remember the human context of all these events as they occur, and these frontier situations. So often we lose that. We don't see that. And so, yes, that's definitely something I've tried to bring out.
Well, and I think that's something important. And of course, listeners of Presidencies know that I try to achieve this in looking at kind of what's happening on the ground, but also trying to understand it in the context of larger trends and larger events that are happening on, a national or in some cases global scale. And likewise, I think that's one of the important aspects of this to keep in mind, this lead up to the Battle of Tippecanoe, the lead up to the War of 1812, is that it wasn't happening in isolation. It wasn't just what was happening in the Indiana Territory, but there were other factors at play as well. And you, in your work, you talk about this because you mentioned in your work how Napoleon's campaigns in Europe, quote, had upended Europe's fashion industry, and that caused the price of furs to drop, which then presented an opportunity for Harrison to acquire more land from Native peoples, because this was, of course, an entire industry to be able to get furs to provide the needs for, the European fashion set. And so would you mind explaining to our audience how this chain of events worked and the impact it had on how events played out in the Old Northwest, and particularly with the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809.
Yeah, it's funny that until I really went into the research for this book, which I spent, I don't know, I think 4.5 years researching and writing it, I didn't understand how important the Napoleonic Wars were and Napoleon himself in early North American history, because that was a huge factor in how things unfolded on the frontier. So specifically what you're talking about, the Treaty of 1809, the Fort Wayne Treaty of 1809, this occurred after Harrison, and this is at the request of Thomas Jefferson, has acquired somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million acres of land from the tribes in just about 3 or 4 years. And he's acquired these vast blocks of land beyond the Greenville Treaty line, the line down the middle of Ohio that was supposed to end the wars between Indians and whites once and for all, because the whites would be on the east side of the line and the Indians would be on the west side of the line. And then Harrison essentially violates that line, and by manipulating tribes in various ways and buying off various chiefs and sub-chiefs. And by 1809, he's making a ploy for another big chunk of land, which is actually a chunk of land that's close to the main village, the center village of Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet. And this is the point where Tecumseh says, no, don't take any more land. This is it. Do not go any farther. However, Harrison had this advantage because the prices of furs had dropped considerably since all the Napoleonic Wars started going on in Europe. Between 1800 and 1809. There was all sorts of armies sweeping this way and that way in Europe, and so that dropped the price of furs, and that left the tribes out on the frontier without a source of ready income, or as ready as they might have had before, where they could go and bring furs to a trading post and trade the furs for muskets and gunpowder and bullets, or other sort of manufactured necessities that they might want to use. And so as the price of furs dropped, it put the tribes at a disadvantage in their negotiations with William Henry Harrison. And that was one of the reasons he could engineer this treaty of 1809. It was like the treaty that pushed Tecumseh and many other Indian leaders over the edge. One reason he was able to negotiate it was because some of the tribes were so desperate for guns, muskets, food. They were just in a really hard place as the price of furs dropped in Europe. So there is, as you were just saying, this big kind of global context that manifests itself way out there on the frontier, way out there from the East Coast or European point of view. But it was very much the center of the tribal life in that region. So Napoleon's actions in Europe had a very direct bearing on the tribal life in 1809 in what's now the upper Midwest.
Well, and I know that listeners of the podcast probably wonder sometimes why I talk so much about Napoleon and what's going on in Europe in a podcast about U.S. presidential history. So thank you, Peter, for validating as an expert that there is a method to my madness. I promise.
Oh yes, go Jerry. Well, so I'm going to have to jump in to reinforce what you're saying with. I mean, one of my favorite parts of that whole Napoleonic Wars story, and I'm sure you either dealt with this directly or touched on it in some of your earlier podcasts, but that how the Louisiana Purchase fell into Thomas Jefferson's hands so easily. And it was because Napoleon, I mean, this guy I never really realized how kind of crazy he was. I mean, just like wildly
Oh,
aggressive
yes.
and so confident. And I mean, just unbelievable. And he, this young guy, and he's just charging through Europe with these massive armies. And, it turns out those armies are pretty expensive once you get several 100,000 men on the march. It takes a lot of money to feed them and, keep them marching. And so Napoleon comes up with this idea, he, in right around 1800, that he needs some cash cows to get some money for cash to keep his armies on the march in Europe. And some of the biggest cash cows in the world at that point are what are known as the sugar islands in the Caribbean. So some of the Dominican Republic, now Haiti, the islands. I think Barbados would have been one. There were several really productive sugar islands that produce sugar cane worth a tremendous amount of cash in the European market. And so Napoleon says, okay, well, here's my plan. I'm going to fund my armies by taking from other European empires these sugar islands in the Caribbean. And then I'll have this, I'll have my ATM machines out there in the Caribbean to fund my European armies. And so as part of that scheme, he has recently taken, his armies have recently taken a chunk of northern Italy. And at this point in 1800, Spain is the one who holds what we call Louisiana, what's we ended up calling the Louisiana Purchase. Spain holds that. So Napoleon now has, he's taken Italy with his armies, and then he goes to Spain and he says, hey, look, I'll give you northern Italy. I'll trade you. I'll give you northern Italy if you give me Louisiana, this huge chunk of territory in North America. And then he's going to use Louisiana, especially the port of New Orleans. He's going to use that as a launching pad to take the cash cow sugar islands of the Caribbean. So he's got his ATM machines to fund his armies marching through Europe. And then this is like one of my favorite stories of American history. I mean, it's grim, but it's so kind of almost random that so Napoleon sends his brother-in-law, General Leclerc, I think is how you'd say it, and he sent his brother-in-law to take Saint-Domingue, and so Napoleon's brother-in-law's armies and his hired soldiers land on Saint-Domingue, and meanwhile there's been a slave revolt, revolution on the island itself, and the thing is just a hotbed of yellow fever. So Napoleon's brother-in-law's armies just go, like face down in the mud with yellow fever and rebellion. And Napoleon's brother-in-law himself goes face down in the mud with yellow fever and dies. And so at this point, Napoleon says, well, that's not working so well, my idea to get the cash cow ATMs of the Caribbean. So I'm going to give up that idea, but I still need some cash. And so, well, maybe I can sell Louisiana to the United States and get some money, get some cash. And so it's just like this almost random, his brother-in-law goes down in the mud in the Caribbean, and suddenly the U.S. ends up with a Louisiana Purchase. And so now Thomas Jefferson has this whole chunk of land from the Mississippi River to the crest of the Rocky Mountains, which changes entirely the course of American history. And it's all through these machinations of this crazy young guy, Napoleon, over in Europe. And so I am reaffirming that you are so right, Jerry, and when you bring up the Napoleonic Wars and talking about Napoleon all the time, it's like, if it weren't for Napoleon, the U.S. would be an entirely different place, I think.
Absolutely. And thank you again. You validated, because I spent a good bit of time talking about the Haitian Revolution as well. And yes, that's a part of the story and part of how the Louisiana Purchase happened. So there we go.
Okay.
Well, and kind of bringing us back from these larger trends to kind of more of what's happening on the ground and in the Old Northwest, of course, the two other major players in this that we haven't talked about yet, we've talked about in the narrative series, We've talked more about Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa and kind of how they started this movement that would play a role in this period, would lead up to the Battle of Tippecanoe, the War of 1812, and ultimately the Battle of the Thames. But looking at some of their circumstances on the ground, Peter, would you mind sharing with us more about Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's family and how their influence contributed to the Confederation that the two would work to build?
That's such a fascinating family, and because they were so known, the two brothers, as figures in that period of early American history, there is a fair amount recorded about them. I mean, compared to a lot of other tribal leaders in earlier times or farther west. And there's still it's not a huge body, but there's quite a lot. And those two brothers, from an exalted family of warriors and leaders, of Shawnee warriors and leaders, and on both sides, on both their father and their mother's side. There's some question whether their mother was part Cherokee or in part Cherokee, part Shawnee, but their mother was clearly from a very exalted line of leaders, both male and female, and likely their father was from a very exalted line of leaders. And so the book Gallop Towards the Sun deals with this in quite some detail. Their early days were so shaped by their family's role as leaders, and that at this time, when they were very young, when the brothers were very young, I say Tenskwatawa, you say you can pronounce it different ways, but Tecumseh and his brother were very young. The British Virginians had just started coming over the Appalachians and really pushing into Kentucky territory. I mean, just the first few, and which led to all sorts of conflicts, and eventually led to what's now known as Lord Dunsmore's War, and that Tecumseh's dad, the brother's dad, died fighting the Virginians, the British Virginians coming over the mountains, and he elicited a pledge from his eldest son to raise all the brothers in the family so to be brave and honorable warriors and to never give in to the whites who were coming into the Shawnee lands. And then he died. The dad died, and eventually Tecumseh's and Tenskwatawa's mother left that whole of Ohio Valley because it was getting too violent, and took her youngest children across the Mississippi into the West. And that left the two brothers to be raised by their older sister, Tecumseh. And she was clearly an extraordinary woman. Again, that these are two of the most fascinating characters in my mind in American history, Nancy Harrison and Tecumseh. And I think they were both extremely influential in the lives of their respective relatives who were leaders. In the case of Tecumseh, her two younger brothers, Tecumseh being one, and that she was, there are written reports about how she was highly respected among the Shawnee women, and that women in Shawnee society had powerful roles in many of those sort of Ohio Valley, Eastern Woodland, tribal Indian Native societies. That women had very significant roles. I mean, they did in all societies, but they were especially almost institutionalized as having exalted roles in these particular societies. And so Tecumseh was a very prominent woman. And I think she was an extraordinary woman. I think she was an extraordinary leader in her own life. And I think she was really wise in the advice that she gave to her younger brothers, and in Tecumseh in particular. And it was said that Tecumseh and Tecumseh had a very strong bond. So that's the family dynamic that, I wish I could write a whole book about that and explore that. I mean, if there were more evidence, I would, but it's just a dynamic I've tried to bring to light in Gallop Toward the Sun, and it's one that I think should be much more widely recognized by history in a parallel way with Nancy Harrison.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the fascinating things, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, because you described kind of the role of women in Shawnee society. And so I was wondering, in your research, how did that contrast with the role of women in more of the American settler context in those societies, and thinking of Nancy, but then any other instances that you may have found in your research?
Well, I think, again, that there's only, so much, written documented evidence available, but there are cultural traditions and there are some, there is some documented evidence. But I think, generally speaking, a role that Nancy would typically have, a white woman in that settler society, would be a much more deferential one to her husband. In Nancy's case, she was a very religious woman. And I think she took a great deal of strength in her religion and her Christianity. I think that she certainly influenced William Henry in a way that was not in any really officially institutional way, but as a presence, as a perspective. I think that she gave that to William Henry. Tecumseh and women in Shawnee society was a more recognized role, as women were considered the givers of life. And that was a very clear distinction. They were not to be involved in the shedding of blood and in violence. And they were the ones who were the creative force. And again, this is, Shawnee society in the Ohio Valley in the 1790s, insofar as it's been recorded. And likewise, the Shawnee males were the hunters, the warriors. They were, to say that they were the destructive force would be putting too blunt an edge on it, or too, was too blunt a term. But they were the ones who did what needed to be done to, shed blood, to defend the territory, to bring home the game. And the women were the ones who were the life forces, and the women had a very prominent role in raising the crops, and especially corn. And, I think that it's, from our perspective, especially as, Europeanized Americans looking back 200 more years, that there's not a sufficient awareness that raising crops was very much a part of a traditional tribal society, especially in the East, in the eastern part of the continent. And so women in Shawnee society had a very prominent role in raising corn, raising what's known as the Three Sisters, this very cool horticultural complex of corn and beans and squash, all grown in a tight plot. So they interweave with each other, and they form a very sturdy, kind of almost insect-proof, moisture-containing, weed-reducing unit. And so the women were in charge of that, and that was essential for the Shawnee survival. And in the same way with many of the Ohio Valley tribes, that according to some reports I've heard and statistics, is that the women actually provided, the women's corn actually provided the tribes, the Shawnee, with more of their protein than the men's hunting. So that's, as a life-giving force, they were very important in a very practical way too.
Absolutely. And it's so fascinating. I think that's one of the things that really comes out in your book, is all of these different people and societies coming together, and in some ways, sometimes supporting one another, but then at times having conflict with one another. But this impact that other people have, and knowing that you need these things to be happening behind the scenes, you need this support, you need the folks who are growing the food to be able to support efforts, and you need supplies to come in to support, settlements in the old Northwest. There's such an interaction of people, for better or worse, and especially, with Tecumseh's aim and goal to create a Native Confederacy to challenge the Western expansion of the United States. It depends on relationships. It depends on these partnerships. And one that he really worked to forge, especially once the war was happening, once the War of 1812 was happening, was this partnership with the British. You get to this point and you talk in your book about it comes to a place that negotiations aren't going to work with Harrison, with the Americans. So he turns to the British. And we didn't really get a chance to talk about this in great detail in the narrative episodes of the podcast. So I want to use this opportunity because it is so important to understand. I was wondering, Peter, if you could share with the audience more about the partnership that was forged between Tecumseh and British General Isaac Brock.
That was a really strong relationship. It was almost a soul bonding the moment they met. And so Isaac Brock was a British, officer who came from, we came from Britain and had a pretty exalted fighting career in Europe. And then when the first battles of the War of 1812 broke out, that he was dispatched from the area that's now, I think, what do I want to say, around Toronto, down the Great Lakes to all the way west down Lake Erie to deal with the Americans who were at Fort Detroit. And the Americans at Fort Detroit were going to invade under General Hull, were going to invade Canada, or they'd started to invade Canada. And this was going to be one of the early moves of the War of 1812, because there was a certain sentiment in the United States. Let's wipe the British right off the continent. So let's invade Canada and take that. And so Brock was this very bold general sent down the Great Lakes with a force to bolster the British fort at Amherstburg, more or less across the river from Detroit, from Fort Detroit. It was in Canada, across the river from Fort Detroit, and Fort Malden. And so Tecumseh at that point had thrown in his lot with the British. The War of 1812 had just broken out, and the British had courted him. He'd gone back and forth, kind of courting the British about stopping the Americans from taking all the tribal lands. And so he was at Fort Malden with, thousands of his Confederated warriors. And Isaac Brock shows up, one night after sailing down the length of Lake Erie for 5 or 6 days in small boats with a lot of soldiers, British soldiers. And they meet in a famous scene, which is recorded by one of Brock's highly educated aides. And it's recorded in detail, and that they instantly hit it off. And Brock, at that point, proposed to Tecumseh and his affiliated war leaders, affiliated war chiefs, that, hey, let's just go across the river and take Fort Detroit. And this was like an extremely bold move. And Tecumseh immediately jumped on. It's like, wow. And the line was that he got up and he said, now this is a man, about General Isaac Brock, because Brock said, let's just go take the American fort across the river. And so they had this kind of comrade in arms relationship, and were very much on the same page, kind of spiritual brothers, bold, courageous, smart, had tremendous charisma as leaders. And so that was a pairing that was extremely effective. And it was an extremely effective pairing over the next several months. And then it ended when Brock was called back east to fight Americans invading back towards the east, farther east in Canada.
Yeah, and that's one of the big what ifs of the War of 1812, and I've seen so many people speculate and ponder what might have happened if Brock hadn't been killed at this point. What would that have meant, and what would that have meant in terms of his partnership with Tecumseh? Would they have been able to achieve their aims and their goals? And unfortunately, it's one of those questions that we'll never know the answer to.
It's a really interesting question to speculate about. That, one of those really key kind of pivotal moments of history when Brock is recalled from the kind of the far frontier around Fort Detroit and Fort Malden back to the eastern Canada, and then is killed leading a charge against invading Americans. And that had he stayed with Tecumseh out on the western end of Lake Erie, out on the frontier, and that whole Fort Detroit area, which was also the kind of key gateway to the west through the Great Lakes. It opened up into Lake Huron and Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. It was like a gateway to the whole interior of the continent. And so that's one of the reasons why those forts, an American and a British fort, were facing each other across that Detroit River, because it was such a key gateway. And if Brock had stayed there and he and Tecumseh had, maintained their partnership, that the British likely would have been far more aggressive in joining with the Indian forces and taking other American forts in that whole region, Fort Wayne being one of them, what's now Fort Wayne, Indiana. And that Brock would have almost surely been far more aggressive than his successor, Proctor, who was very hesitant to actually kind of go after these American forts. So, right, would that have, the phrase I've used, would that have sprung open the back door to the United States? That this was a hope of both British and the tribes, and Tecumseh in specific, to push the U.S. line of settlement back towards the Appalachians, back as far as the original Greenville Treaty line, which was, as I was saying, it kind of zigzags down the middle of Ohio. If Brock had been there, this bold British general, if he hadn't been recalled and then killed, if he'd stayed out there on the western frontier with Tecumseh, would the combined British and Indian forces had the wherewithal, they'd certainly had the courage to capture a number of these other forts, these frontier forts, and literally push settlement right back to the middle of Ohio, where it might have stayed. I mean, that was the British vision and the Indian vision, that there was going to be what the British called an Indian barrier state right down the middle of the continent that was possessed only by the tribes.
But of course, we know how things went. And, with the War of 1812, we know that ultimately Tecumseh would meet his end at the Battle of the Thames, and it would end up with the status quo antebellum in terms of Britain and the U.S. But as you write towards the end of your work, quote, neither Britain nor the United States won the War of 1812, but it soon became clear that native nations lost. for the Americans, a new identity was forged, but for Native peoples, the cultural dismantling that was already underway was only exacerbated by the war. And so I was wondering if you would mind speaking for a moment about how the circumstances in Eastern North America differed following the war versus where they were when the war began. And Peter, do you feel that this shift was inevitable, or could circumstances have been different if the war had concluded differently?
That is a really provocative question. I have to say, I could speculate about that for a long time, and or we both could, which would be very engaging to do. Um, let's see if I take the first part of it. That it's. I think I was, before I started researching and writing this book, I think I was with, like most Americans who have a general background in history or school days, American history, just kind of the overall. And the War of 1812, it really didn't mean much in my mind one way or the other, and until I started really looking into it. And obviously, Jerry, you've done a whole lot of reading and research and interviewing about the War of 1812. And I, as I was saying before, I actually defer to your expertise about it, but more than mine. In its consequences, it doesn't jump out in the American historical imagination because not much changed in the eastern part of the continent. And even though we had these kind of notable events like the Francis Scott Key writing what ended up being the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner, was it the bombardment of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, and then the British sacking and burning the U.S. Capitol, that war towards the end of the War of 1812 and 1814. And then there was the Battle of New Orleans, which actually occurred after the war ended. But all these things, in the end, the U.S. and Great Britain, after having these kind of battles up and down the continent and lots of seagoing duels, battles out at sea, and that kind of, it didn't resolve itself anyway. And they finally both sides just said, okay, well, I don't know, this doesn't seem to be getting either of us anywhere. Let's just kind of call it off. And they just sort of, the U.S. and Great Britain came to this agreement. Okay, we're stopping hostilities, and here's the settlement. We're going to put the boundaries, the national boundaries, back to where they were before the war started. So let's just go back to the status quo. So that happened on the in the eastern part of the continent. I mean, especially the east coast part of the continent. And but there was this sort of, revival of this American spirit, that will stand up to any invading foreign power. Don't mess with us. That spirit really grew out of the War of 1812. But on the Western frontier, that things changed quite dramatically because the Indians, the British essentially walked away from their alliance that they'd forged with the tribes, with Tecumseh in particular, and his affiliated leaders. The British walked away from that, so that left the tribes, kind of sort of left them almost sort of hanging in the wind, but they or twisting in the wind, but they did manage to actually take back quite a lot of territory out through the what was in the far west, meaning Illinois and Wisconsin along the Mississippi River. But that ultimately that didn't work either. And so my kind of take on the War of 1812 is that it really didn't change much on the East Coast, but it changed things quite dramatically in the western part of the continent, in the sense that the British left the Indians on their own through the Midwest. And had the British not abandoned the Indians, that could have had a very dramatically different effect on the ultimate shape of America. If that would have actually come to be true held over the next decades, it's really hard to tell. That there was so much incredible momentum on the part of American settlers pushing west. It's and they had literally the numbers, and the Indian tribes eventually came to recognize that they were just so outnumbered. I mean, not only outgunned in some ways, but just wildly outnumbered by this constant pouring of American settlers and then American soldiers coming west. And so could they have held their ground had the British really committed themselves to it? Well, and the British would have had to really commit themselves to it. I mean, could you imagine, they're still dealing with Napoleon in Europe, but they're also pouring resources into the wilderness of North America to try to hold the line against these American settlers and American armies pushing westward. I mean, I think, improbable. It's not impossible, but the Brits would have had to see an overwhelming reason to do this. And essentially, they didn't have the wherewithal, the ambition, or the resources to hold that line. So I guess my answer ultimately would be, well, probably that it was inevitable. But on the other hand, and I'm starting to write and research about this a little bit more now. The Spain was out in the West, or was supposed to be out in the West, and if Spain had a greater commitment to holding on to the West, and the Brits had more of a commitment to holding on to the Midwest and the Mississippi Valley, that might have shortened up the U.S. to Ohio or Illinois. Who knows? But I could speculate on this for the rest of the day, and I'm sure you have some thoughts too. What do you think, Jerry?
Well, and I agree with you. I think that's the big X factor here. And again, it's important to understand in the context of the War of 1812 that simultaneously you had the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you had Napoleon's fall from power, and you had post-Napoleonic Europe coming together, and the impact that had on what the British were willing to do or not. You have a nation that's been at war for 2 decades, and so much money and manpower and resources has been put into the war effort for so long. Would they have really committed to this, and why? Why would they have committed to this? Was there enough of a return on that investment for Britain? And most likely not. They were, and we see this in post-Napoleonic Europe. They're starting to find this new schema, which in some ways was a continuation of what was pre-Napoleonic, but it never really got there. There were folks that were trying to push for that, but all of that was happening, and meanwhile, the native peoples, if Britain wasn't all in, there was no way that they were going to be able to truly match what seemed this juggernaut of a force. From the American perspective, you had folks had been pushing for decades to try and get into these new lands to settle, even when it was technically illegal for them to do so. They were still doing it. And so you just have to wonder whether, if the British weren't completely committed, and there are questions about why would they be, would it really have worked? And I think I'm with you, Peter. I think it was inevitable. I think that it would have looked a bit different. It may have been delayed, but I think that westward expansion was probably coming one way or another. And unfortunately, the native cultures and native peoples of the area were always going to get caught in that.
So yes, I think, yeah, we're kind of on the same page about ultimately the force pushing west was so powerful that it would take something extraordinary to resist it, an extraordinary commitment on Britain's part, Spain's part, and the Confederated tribes. But let's just flip the question around for a second, which is I haven't really thought about it this way very much. But okay, let's just say that was the summer of 1812, because the war was declared in June of 1812, and Isaac Brock, the bold British general, sailed down Lake Erie in, I think, late July or August, right around then. But let's say that Brock didn't sail down, and for whatever reason, and let's say, General Hall, the 60-year-old grandfather, American general in Detroit, with his grandkids and daughter and wife with him at Fort Detroit. Let's say he kept pushing the invasion of Canada from Fort Detroit. He started it. He started to invade Canada from Fort Detroit in the summer of 1812. And let's just say he had the commitment personally, and he also had the resources, like, a bunch of his reinforcements didn't get caught in Ohio's Black Swamp, which is a barrier to reinforcing Fort Detroit. But say he kept pushing into Canada, and and Brock never arrived, and the British didn't really have a commitment to a very strong commitment to hold on to Canada. That would be an interesting way to flip around this equation. Would the British actually got knocked right off of the North American continent if say Brock hadn't arrived, and the U.S. forces had both the will and the wherewithal to push the British out of Canada? Do you think that's in any way a likely or possible outcome?
Well, and it's interesting. That's one of the things that I tried to highlight in the narrative series when folks talk about the war hawks and how, there is this idea, oh, well, we'll just walk into Canada and we'll take it. We really won't have to fight it at all. They'll welcome us and everything's going to be fine. It's just going to be a quick mop up in Canada. When you look at the circumstances, you understand kind of why there was this conception, because Canada at that point was very sparsely populated, at least by British forces and citizens. It was just this collection of sparse settlements. There really wasn't a big military presence there. And indeed, at the very beginning, if things would have worked out with the three-pronged attack, the attack from Detroit, the attack from the Niagara front, and then the attack on Montreal, the British forces that were in Canada could not have repelled all three of those simultaneously. It was really when Detroit was knocked out and then they were able to shift resources over further east, and then things got delayed on the attack of Montreal, that taking them out one front at a time, that's when things happened. But if that hadn't happened, if Detroit hadn't fallen and they had been able to carry out all these attacks, it is quite probable that, it could have been taken. At the same time, you also have to wonder, in occupied territory, and we don't really have a firm way of understanding, how the population in Canada would have reacted to now being American, being, part of the United States. Would there have been a resistance, or would they have just said, okay, whatever, maybe things will be better? That's also a point that, and I'm sure there are scholars who have done more work into this that could speak with more confidence, but it wasn't so far-fetched as sometimes, with hindsight, we tend to view it as, given the circumstances of the time. You can see why people like Henry Clay and the Warhawks thought, this was very viable.
Well, I suppose it's one thing, I've been saying it's one thing to claim the territory as yours, and it's another thing to hold on to the territory that you're claiming as yours.
Exactly.
And when you think about Canada, you can march across the river from Fort Detroit and claim the whole landmass up to the North Pole and say it's yours, but good luck hanging on to that. That is such a huge landmass. So it's in that way, it's kind of it's almost an academic question, because whoever actually the land, technically belongs to anybody who can hang on to it, and that's the tricky part.
Yeah, and that really becomes the story of the westward expansion of the United States. You have all these large tracts of land that have been claimed by the British and the Spanish and the Russians, and it's how are you going to keep it? And we see that like in the Spanish context with what ultimately became the American Southwest and, parts of the American South, it became, they just couldn't hold it. And you have these revolutions that pop up. You have the Mexican American War, and they just can't hold it. And so it's really fascinating to think about, could this have worked? And I don't think we have any firm way of saying for certain, but I don't think that, I think that there is an argument to be made that it could at least, there was at least that possibility.
Yes, definitely. And it's one of the things that's become so clear to me about writing about this, about early American history, and especially this, I've been writing a lot about first contact between Europeans and indigenous people and indigenous Americans, and these very early periods of settlement. And one thing that's become really clear to me is in these very early moments of contact between Europe and the Americas, that in a way, like, I wouldn't call them small actions, but the actions of smaller groups of individuals can end up having kind of profound and far-reaching historical consequences. Like, who actually steps on the soil first and manages to build a little fort, or who gets knocked off that place and somebody else comes in, or who goes forward, who turns back. I've really come to, I've always been fascinated by those moments, but it's become clearer and clearer to me that in a historical sense, that those moments have the far-reaching consequences through the decades and the centuries that might be what might not seem to be as profound a moment when it occurs, but it occurs so early in the settlement of the New World, let's put it that way, that it echoes down through the centuries and has a lot of determining factor, determination in the shape of the Americas today, the geopolitical shape. So that's actually a really interesting area of inquiry, and that's actually what I'm starting to work on for a next project, is having to do with just what you're talking about, the Spanish settlement in the West, and or lack of it, and some of their explorations. And so that's a project that I'm looking forward to delving into, and I hope you and I can speak more about these moments in the future with in different geographical areas and different people and different empires and different native nations.
And I would love that, Peter. That's been something that I've been diving into myself, because, and focus on the Madison presidency, there isn't as much attention to what's going on in some cases nominally Spanish held lands, during this period, and knowing that this also has a context with the Napoleonic Wars and in particular the Peninsular War in Iberia, but it was impacting what was going on in the U.S. and across the continent and across the hemisphere. And it's so fascinating. There's so much to it, but it has a major impact on the course of history. And so I've been doing research about that myself. So I would love, as you get further along, and I'd love to have you on to talk more about that.
Okay. Oh yeah. We'll make it a date. It would be really fun to do.
Wonderful.
And it's like in a way, it's a historical exploration. It's where I am at this point, and it sounds like you are too. It's that these lines of inquiry that are kind of obscure in some ways in the regular telling of American history, and yet they lead to some really surprising discoveries. These lines of historical inquiry. And one thing is funny that you mentioned Madison, that I should just find the most definitive biography of Madison I can find. I'm so interested in how he thought of, the West, quote unquote, the West, and if he thought about it much at all, because in the research I've done is that he, he was really an Eastern guy, an Eastern focused guy. He was a, as they call it, he was focused on the Atlantic world. And he was, obviously extremely smart, extremely well read, this amazing guy. But he was not a William Henry Harrison or an Andrew Jackson out there with his hatchet on the frontier. And so I'm just so curious to try to understand more about just how he conceived of the West.
Well, and it's interesting in my research, and I did some research around John Jacob Astor, and of course, Astor was trying to talk to Madison about his idea, and this goes back to Astoria, kind of where we began the conversation. This idea of a string of trading posts across the continent, and it's this grand scheme, but it's fascinating to read more about. And so his proposal to Madison was, well, if we're going to do this, we're going to need support. And can we have some military support? What resources can the federal government give? And Madison was just like, not really interested in this. And
yeah, right.
And I
might think as far as Lake Erie, that's as far as my brain's going to go.
Exactly. And it kind of speaks to,
and meanwhile, when you think of it,
oh, go ahead.
No, I was just laughing because we're both laughing, but I'm thinking of Madison's predecessor, our famous Thomas Jefferson. So when Astor approaches Thomas Jefferson like in 1808 or whenever, 1807, 1808, and proposes his grand scheme of trading posts across the continent and a trans-Pacific global trade empire, and Jefferson says, "Dude, go for it. We'll give you all the support we can give you." And then Madison comes in, a year or two later, and says, I don't know about that. No, I'm not thinking that way." And so it's such a wild contrast.
Well, and you have to wonder if Jefferson in his conversations with Astor, if he asked, I know Lewis and Clark didn't find them, but while you're doing this, if you can just be on the lookout for mastodons, woolly mammoths, anything like that, I'm pretty sure they're out there. Just let me know. I'm pretty sure they're out there.
All right. Let me know. Bring some extra horses to bring back one of those mastodons with you.
Exactly. Exactly. But yeah, it
was great. We have to have some future conversations about all this because it's so fun to kick this around. I love doing it.
Absolutely. Well, and to kind of bring us back and kind of close out our conversation about your latest book, I just want to ask, and you've talked a little bit about this, but just to close us out, Peter, did your impressions of Tecumseh, Harrison, or you've spoken a little bit about this, that some of your views of the time period shifted in the course of your research, but in terms of Tecumseh and Harrison, if there was any shift in your views of them, and if so, what was the most surprising shift in understanding, for better or worse?
Well, let's take Tecumseh first. That it was really interesting that his transformation, which I learned more about as I did more research, that he was kind of a natural leader growing up as a kid. Was a 10-year-old and 12-year-old, and he was leader of all the boys. Some of his contemporaries later reported, and his father, his family had been great leaders. So he was kind of had this leadership, what do you want to call it, gene or whatever, talent. But then there was a period when he just said, "Okay, I'm done, and I want to live in peace." And this was after the Greenville Treaty of 1795, which drew the treaty line down the middle of Ohio. And it was surprising because Tecumseh had been fighting alongside his older brother and down in Kentucky and Tennessee against white invaders, white settlers. And then after all this, really active warrior life, that he just said, okay, I'm done with that. I want to just settle down, and I love hunting. I just want to go, I want to sort of like, I want to retire to my quiet spot in the woods and go deer hunting. It was almost like that. And then there came a moment when it became clear that he wasn't going to have a quiet spot in the woods to go deer hunting. And he, I think, in considerable part through his older sister Tecumseh, rose to the occasion to say, okay, I'm coming out of retirement as a warrior, even though he's, in his early 30s or so at this point. I'm going to do what it takes to put together this incredible coalition. And I'm traveling thousands of miles to put it together, which he did. And so he went from this very, having this, strong early leadership as a very young man to this really quiet, almost retired period, and then coming out blazingly in his 30s and into his 40s when all this Harrison's push west was coming to a head. At the same time, Harrison, he's a really kind of complex figure in the sense that he is I was saying he's kind of chameleon-like. That there's this evidence that he was as a young man he joined the abolitionist society in Virginia. I mean, this is like joining the Communist Party in, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a time to do it. 1950s Hollywood signing up for the Communist Party. That it was such a controversial thing, and his father was a huge slave owner. And so as a 17-year-old, that he apparently joined the Abolition Society. But then as he grew older, he completely renounced that part of himself. And he tried to introduce slavery into the Northwest Territory, which was specifically designated by Congress to be slave-free. And Harrison did everything he could to slide slavery in there under various overt or disguised forms. So he's a guy who has a sort of, it feels like a really shifting moral compass, but very accomplished. And, he was like charismatic, which was surprising. The more I learned about him, the more charismatic I got the impression that he was. I mean, he sounded like a fun guy, basically. And yet he was, I guess you could say, what's the word? I mean, I suppose you could use the word he was both smart and cunning at the same time. And that he was an incredible opportunist, basically, and a successful one. I think that my biggest surprise in researching and writing this book is that one of my heroes, who's still, in a lot of ways, one of my heroes, Thomas Jefferson, as the man of the Enlightenment and trying to bring so many of those Enlightenment values to the founding of this nation. There's the whole slavery issue, which is we've known that about him for a long time, but that his attitude towards Native Americans was really disconcerting for me and really disheartening. And that I go back to this, this, I call it a secret letter, which is totally accurate. He wrote a secret letter to Harrison in 1803, and he said, basically, get as much land from the Indians as quickly as you can. Here's the strategy. Get the leading chiefs in debt as deeply as you can at the government trading posts so they have to give up their lands. And, and he said, don't ever show this letter to anybody. And so he had no respect for the tribes as entities whatsoever when it came to his interest in pushing the U.S. westward and defending it against the possible French, possible Napoleonic invasion on the western border, which I think was highly unlikely. But he would do whatever it takes in terms of the tribes, and yet didn't want anybody to know what he was up to. So I found that really kind of upsetting to learn that about Thomas Jefferson.
Definitely. Yeah. And that in and of itself is a conversation. And if our listeners haven't taken anything away, which there is so much to take away from this conversation, is that this is only the tip of the iceberg. We've been talking this long and there's still so much more in Peter's book. So I highly recommend that you check it out. The book is Gallop Toward the Sun, Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation. Cannot recommend it enough. Be sure to check it out. It is on sale as of August 29th, 2023. So if you're listening to this after that point, it is available wherever you get your books. Peter, I cannot thank you enough for this conversation. This has been wonderful, and I would be more than glad to take you up on that offer for future conversations.
Okay. Well, we will do it. I would love to do that. I had a really fun, engaging, and enlightening time talking with you, Jerry. And you bring so much knowledge to and insight to the conversation. It's like it's a learning experience for me. So I'd love to do it again. And I should say about my book, which is coming out the end of August, Gallop Toward the Sun, that it's also available. It's available as an audio book as well. There's a very good narrator who's narrated it, so that's available. That'll be available after end of August 29th too. If anybody wants to listen to it, I think it'll be a really engaging listening experience, I think.
Wonderful. I know that we've got some regular listeners who are audiobook fans, so be sure to check that out. So, Peter, thank you so much again, and thank you for our listeners.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and we'll be talking again.
My heartfelt thanks again to Peter for an amazing conversation. I cannot thank him enough for the time and insight that he provided, and hope that we're able to have him join us as a guest again before too long. Special thanks also to Rachel Parker of Random House for reaching out and connecting Peter and myself for this interview. Be sure to pick up a copy of Peter Stark's Gallop Toward the Sun, Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation, when it hits the shelves on August 29th, 2023. I'll have a link for more information on the book on the page for this episode on my website, which is presidenciespodcast, all one word.com. There, you can also find past episodes, links to resources on all of the American presidents, and information about how you, yes, you, can support the Presidency's podcast. A special thanks to all of our patrons whose support helps to offset the cost of hosting and producing the podcast. If you'd like to reach out, please feel free to email me at presidenciespodcast, again, all one word, @gmail.com. Or, if you don't follow me on social media already, you can reach out through one of the many platforms I'm on. I'm on Facebook, Mastodon, and Post as Presidencies, on Twitter, or X, if it's still that when you're listening, at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads at Presidencies Podcast, again, all one word. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Welcome to Anthology of Heroes, the podcast that explores the most pivotal moments of history through the eyes of those who lived it. In this podcast, we don't spend our time recounting facts and dates. Instead, we follow in the footsteps of national heroes, kings, or ordinary people who lived and breathed the moments that shaped our world. We're not hemmed in by eras, borders, or religions. Instead, we seek out the tales of those who defied the odds and fought passionately for their beliefs. Whether they're right or wrong is up to you to decide. From Vercingetorix's doomed rebellion against Rome, to Osceola's unshakable war against the USA, all the way up to the inspiring Sobibor concentration camp uprising in World War II, each episode is an immersive listening experience, blending music and sound effects to really draw you into the story. Our episodes go for about 45 minutes, making them perfect for your commute, and are crafted using a wealth of historical sources, which I list on our website if you want to learn more. I'm the host, Elliot Gates, and I'm thrilled to have you joining me as we uncover history's hidden gems and illuminate the faded pages of our past. Look out for the Anthology of Heroes podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else you get your podcasts from.